Good morning. Good morning, and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, episode number 177, where we're looking at ships, coasts, and lifeboats. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. And the Highland Archive Service has 4 centres for looking after the historic documents of this part of the world. We have one in Inverness, one in Wick, one in Portree, and one in Fort William. And this series was started nearly, we'll be going into our 5th year in a couple of weeks, which is absolutely extraordinary. And it was started really just to share some of the stories from within our collections. Initially to help parents who were homeschooling during COVID, but has broadened out from those initial 14 episodes into 177 so far, and has brought us so many interesting things and opportunities to speak at events and be involved with things. So a little bit of background about Learn with Lorna if you are new to it. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work and help us to continue telling our stories and other people's stories, then we would be very, very grateful for that. So this week we are moving from the kind of fun and laughter of last week's Angus Og to something more serious, looking at the loss of life at sea, coastlines, lighthouses, and lifeboats. Thank you for all your comments about Angus Og last week. I had a great time reading through them and people's memories of Angus Og. Always a relief to hear from the people of the Western Isles that you've done them justice. That was a relief. So this week we are looking, as I say, at coastlines, lighthouses and lifeboats to tie in with the 200th anniversary of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, which was founded on the 4th of March 1824. So I hope you had a chance to see some of the pictures that I had shared on our Facebook page. I know that my colleagues in Sky had shared some as well. So some really fascinating images. I've spoken many, many times over the last 176 episodes about the role that the coast has played in the Highlands and Islands. Our coastline has brought us prosperity and trade and jobs. For instance, we talk often about the herring industry. Our coast has seen immigrants arriving into Scotland and of course has seen a huge influx of emigrants leaving these shores. And Highlanders who left to leave a mark on other parts of the world, both positive and negative, and everywhere from Jamaica to New Zealand, we can see the role that our coasts have played. But our coastlines have, of course, also witnessed tragedy and huge loss of life, and all the subsequent effects of that loss. And I see your comment there, Stuart, there about the impact that seas and ships and both the joys of being at sea and the loss, the dangers of being at sea that have had across the UK. So if we have a look in the statistical accounts, then we can see some evidence of the problems, the loss of life and the impact that loss can have on families, on communities. Have a listen to this story from the first statistical account from the parish of Och, so written in 1795. A crew of fishermen, having been accidentally drowned in 1792, left 7 widows and a good many dependents, some of them in the most pitiful circumstances. One young girl in particular, who at 19 years of age had been married only 7 months before, was by this unforeseen accident bereaved at one time of her husband, her father, her brother, and left big with child and in debt. On this melancholy occasion, it was found necessary to ask some charitable assistance from other places, and a liberal supply was obtained, adequate to their more immediate needs. For besides what was collected within the bounds of this presbytery, the following contributions were received from different quarters, mostly unsolicited, were remitted to the Kirk Session for the relief of these unfortunate people, and all have been distributed amongst them. From the town and neighbourhood of Inverness, £32 and 5 shillings. From some gentlemen of Nairnshire and Fort George, £6, 5 shillings and 6pence. And a collection made in the parish church of Alness, 5, 1 and 8. The distress of the widows having been thus mitigated, particularly such of them as been left pregnant, were delivered and nursed their infants. and they have now almost all returned to their habits of industry sufficient to support themselves and their families. Such examples, it is hoped, will not be thought misplaced in this statistical account, because they do not only in their measure do honour to human nature, but may tend to encourage others to do likewise when similar cases arise. So, a description there of just one of many situations of those 7 fishermen being lost, the impact that that has had on that community, on those wives and daughters and sisters, the babies, the finances for the local area. So we can see evidence of the devastation that loss of life at sea could cause. There's this particularly descriptive extract from the Latheran second statistical account, which shows that that experience was shared and feared right across the Highlands and, of course, further afield. But this is from Latheran in Caithness. Not unfrequently, the scene is sadly reversed. They've just been talking about the joy of a good catch coming in. But in the midst of the joys of life, we often are in death. A storm suddenly arises during the night. The boats are all riding quietly at their nets and are unprepared to meet it. Some endeavour to haul their nets, others cut from them and make for the place of greatest shelter, while others, afraid to put up sail and encounter it, abide by their nets in the hope of the storm abating. In proportion to the danger at sea are the confusion and anxiety that unfolds on land. The shores are instantly crowded with inquiring relatives, hurrying from place to place in search of husbands, brothers, or sons. Astonishing instances of preservation often occur, but no season passes without serious losses to individuals either of boats or nets, and sometimes of lives. The risks are very great, and the employment, even when successful, is most trying to the constitution. So we have a lot of evidence that we can find of the dangers, of the risks of a life spent at sea. And some stretches of water are particularly dangerous. I've spoken before about the Pentland Firth, but this extract from the first statistical account of Dunnet Parish really paints a great picture of the particular challenges faced by those sailing around the north coast of the Scottish mainland. The current in the Pentland Firth is exceedingly strong during spring tides, so that no vessel can stem it. The flood tide runs from west to east at the rate of 10 miles an hour, with new and full moon. It is then high water at Scarskerry, where the ferry boat crosses from Dunnet to Orkney at 9 o'clock. Immediately as the water begins to fall on the shore, the current turns to the west, but the strength of the flood is so great in the middle of the firth that it continues to run east till about 12. These contiguous currents, running at amazing velocity in opposite directions, have a strange appearance from the land. So something very, very particular to the area. It says the appearance gradually advances towards the firth and along the shore, although the effects of it are not much felt upon the shore until it reaches Scarskerry Head, which is about 3 miles distant from Dunnet Head, as the land between these 2 points forms a considerable bay. By 2 o'clock, the whole firth looks to be in a rage. About 3 in the afternoon, it is low water on the shore, where all the former phenomenon begin to be reversed, and the smooth water begins to appear on the land, gradually advancing until it reaches the middle of the firth. From the strength of the tides and the surprising velocity of all these currents happening at the same time in opposite directions, the Pentland Firth is a very dangerous navigation to strangers, especially if they approach it near the land. But the natives along the coast are so well acquainted with the direction of all these tides that they can take advantage of every one to carry them safe from one harbour to another. Very few accidents happen, but where they do, very few accidents happen but from want of skill or knowledge of the tides. So there are plenty of accidents, but they tend to be people who just don't understand the land that the bit of water that they're in. It goes on to describe one particular situation. In spring 1791, there was a vessel from Danzig, about 500 or 600 tons burden, passing through the Pentland Firth on a voyage. The master, finding the current against him in the middle of the firth, about 8 or 9 miles east of Dunnet Head, bore in for the shore, where he fell in with the last of the ebb, called by the people here the Waterbirth. The west, I can't see what that says. The wind was about northwest, and the current brought him up past Scarskerry, but he was so near the shore that the people on land were much alarmed for his safety. A boat went out and offered him a pilot, which he refused, and on which they advised him to stand some miles out to sea. When he came up close to Dunnet Head, he tacked and stood out only about a mile to sea. Finding the current strong to the west, he thought it unnecessary to continue longer on that tack, as he knew it was not near low water in the firth, upon which he tacked again and stood to the west, hoping all danger was over. He cleared Dunnet Head, but by that time it had begun to flow upon the shore, and the easter burst setting in soon reached him with considerable strength. Upon finding his vessel carried out to the east by the stern and fast approaching the headland, he attempted to tack, but found that impossible, as the wind and the current being nearly in the same direction, the vessel would not answer to the helm. He then attempted to weir, but to no better effect. And the people on shore observed that nothing in that situation could have saved him but dropping an anchor over the stern, and the moment that he found that hold, so as to turn the vessel standing to sea. Neglecting that precaution, he was driven ashore and wrecked, and that through mere ignorance, without the least stress of weather. So a kind of convoluted story, probably better understood to those who are involved in shipping and the sea. But the fact that the locals went out to give that advice, and he said, no, I've got it under control, and then they watched as the ship was wrecked, even in weather that wasn't that dangerous. So there were skills, as there still are, that could be learned, could be shared, could be utilised, just as in that example. But in the people who are in strange waters were still at risk, even in still weather. And then, of course, everybody was at risk when storms sprung up or the weather changed. And one way that people looked to counter the loss of life at sea was by putting in preventative measures, putting things in place that would avoid ships being wrecked or run aground in the first place. Beacons, for instance, have been used for centuries to warn of danger, including the dangers of the coast. And this developed into the widespread use of lighthouses to warn of dangerous stretches of coast. Foghorns then developed to warn ships of the proximity of land in foggy weather where the light might not penetrate. And turning again to the statistical accounts, we can see evidence of where these life-saving structures were implemented and the difference that they made. This one is from Durness, County of Sutherland. About another building of importance is the lighthouse at Cape Wrath, the tower of which is 50 feet high. This building is altogether 350 feet above the level of the sea. It was built in 1827 of granite found at the Cape. Previous to its erection, seldom a winter passed without one or more wrecks, but these are now of rare occurrence. We also see evidence of where lighthouses weren't built but were desperately hoped for. So in Canisby in Caithness, a lighthouse proposed. For many reasons that might be advanced, there is not around the island of Britain a station where a lighthouse is more requisite than in the mouth of the Pentland Firth. A year does not pass without some fatal accident to shipping for the want of it. Either at Duncansby Head or at the largest of the Pentland Skerries is a station where a lighthouse ought to be erected. A light on the head would serve to illuminate the Pentland Firth to the west and the German Ocean to the east, as far as the eye could discern it. No doubt its altitude in foggy weather is an argument against it as a station for a lighthouse, but from the prevalence of winds in this quarter of the world, fogs would be very rarely obstructing the light. The Skerry also would unquestionably be in many respects a good station. It is east of the head and of every part of the coast. They go on to say that the various pros and cons of these two different sites, but the fact that to have them would save lives. A lighthouse in either of these stations would be an infallible safeguard to vessels from mistaking the bays of Rhys and Freswick in the night for the Pentland Firth. This has been done often, and the most fatal consequences have ensued. All mariners declare that they would have no hesitation in sailing through the Pentland Firth at the dead of night than at midday if they had the guidance of a lighthouse to direct their course. The number of vessels that pass and repass the Pentland Firth in the course of a year is reckoned to be upwards of 2,000. So, accidents did happen, there was a need for it, some preventative measures were in place, things like lighthouses, but often when those accidents did happen, there were very few things that people could do other than either go out to help in a boat which was equally vulnerable, which many people did, or the other option was to stand and watch helplessly from the shore as ships were dashed on rocks. And lives were saved. We can see that, for instance, in Wick, those who were piloting the boats out of the local area were awarded medals for their bravery in going out and to try and to save lives and to try and prevent the deterioration of crashes. But a better system for saving or trying to save lives at sea was needed. And so the Coast Guard had been established in 1822, following on from the work done by the Preventative Water Guard. And their main role, the Coast Guard's main role, was to combat smuggling on the coast. But they did also have a remit to help in cases of shipwreck, and they have certainly been responsible for saving many lives. But the role specifically of saving lives at sea was largely taken on by volunteer life brigades, local lifeboat stations, and then from 1824, the newly formed RNLI. And they have different functions. So as I say, the Coast Guard's remit is slightly different. And also those local volunteer life brigades often worked from shore trying to save life at sea as opposed to being sea-based. So from 1824, we have the RNLI. It was in the 1780s that the first purpose-built lifeboats began to appear. London coach builder Lionel Lucan's design for his unemergible boat came in 1785. And then the designs of William Woodhave and Henry Greathead started to become prevalent. Now, there is some phenomenal information on the RNLI's website. I would really encourage you to go and have a look at it if you're interested in this subject, and I'll come back to that shortly. But it tells the story of Lionel Lucan, his design for his unemergible boat, and then a competition that saw William Woodhave and Henry Greathead competing against each other to try and win a competition to design a lifeboat. But it's now Greathead's name which has come down to us as the most familiar in connection with lifeboat design. And here's how the RNLI describe his invention and how it came about. It wasn't until 1789 that action was taken to design a purpose-built lifeboat, prompted by a tragedy at the mouth of the River Tyne. A ship named Adventure ran aground during a violent storm, but little could be done to save the crew's lives because the sea was too rough for the local men to take out their boats, and instead they had to stand by helplessly as the Adventure's crew drowned. The disaster inspired South Shield's private law house committee to find an inventor who could design and build a lifeboat. They launched a lifeboat design competition and offered a reward of 2 guineas, around £2.10, for the best design. Among the entrants were parish clerk William Woodhave, and boat builder Henry Francis Greathead, both from South Shields. Woodhave's design, modelled in tin, was for a boat made out of copper and cork that would right itself in stormy seas. Greathead's model was built out of wood, and although it had some great features, it didn't self-right. Neither design was therefore an outright winner. Instead, the committee took elements of both to produce a final lifeboat design. William Woodhave was offered half of the prize money as a reward for his efforts, and he took offence to it and rejected the money. Henry Greathead was asked to build the lifeboat from the final design, pulling in elements from both, and he went on to become known as the inventor of the lifeboat. The Zetland is Greathead's only surviving original type lifeboat. Built in 1802, she saved over 500 lives, and the Zetland Lifeboat Museum in Redcar is dedicated to her 78 years of service. Greathead took the final design and added his own modifications, and the result was aptly named Original, the first purpose-built lifeboat. Measuring 9 metres long and 3 metres wide, she could carry 20 people, including a crew of 12. She was steered by 2 oars trailed over the stern rather than a rudder, and could be rowed in either direction. She was powered by 10 short oars rather than full-length oars to make her more manageable in heavy seas. Her sides were cased with cork and secured with copper plates, increasing her buoyancy considerably. A curved keel made her easier to steer. She was stationed at South Shields and remained in service there until 1830. Her first service took place on the 30th of January 1790 when she rescued a shipwrecked crew on hard sand. Henry Greathead went on to build 31 original type lifeboats over the next 2 decades for communities around the coast and abroad. He never took out a patent on this invention and was always willing to share his plans for the good of others and for the cause of saving lives at sea. And I was fascinated to read that story, so often the way that competitions are involved in these things. But I then, having read about that, went to look to see if I could find evidence of that sharing of those new lifeboats that came out and started to be put round the coasts and the impact that that had. And I found various newspaper reports that spoke about that incident at Hard Sand that the first lifeboat went out to. And it's really clear the impact that the lifeboats had immediately. And they started to be commissioned and, as I say, dispersed around the coast. And this is an article from the Caledonian Mercury of the 23rd of January 1802. This doesn't deal with the Highlands, it's detailing what happened to what it meant to the people of St Andrews when they got their lifeboat. So it's not our area, but it's very representative, I think, of how people realised that this invention could transform the possibility of saving lives at sea. This is what happened. St Andrews, 12th of January 1802. Through the exertions of Teen of Guild, Cath Dempster, Almighty God has been pleased to bless this part of the coast with an excellent lifeboat built by the ingenious Mr. Greathead. In the tempestuous weather of last week, we made 2 trials of her performance, which answered the most sanguine expectation. The easy motion with which she mounted and descended the proudest billows and cast herself over the fiercest breakers excited the utmost interest and admiration. In the second trial, even when driven by the violence of the storm, in a great measure at the mercy of the waves, under God she landed on the beach without injury to herself or danger to the crew, and thus afforded the numerous spectators on the shore a pleasing pledge of her future usefulness, when God, in the more awful visitations of his providence, shall require her services in saving the lives of any of our fellow creatures. So you really get the feeling from that, of the concept or the understanding of storms coming from God and the ramifications of that, but also what this could do for them in saving lives. And again, the feeling that this is God's provision. So inspired by these trials, by Greathead's invention, Sir William Hillary and others envisioned a system of lifeboat provision. So rather than one-off ad hoc places that could manage to get a boat together, he wanted to develop a system of lifeboat provision, a network of boats and stations and crews across the UK and Ireland who would be ready to respond to a crisis at sea. And in 1824, he finally received enough support to make this a reality, and the RNLI was born. It was originally called the National Institute for the Preservation of Life from Shipwreck, the name being changed in 1854. And I'm not going to go into the entire history of the RNLI, but I really would recommend that you have a look at their website. They have got the most phenomenal, detailed timeline, which takes you through the developments of lifeboat design, the medals that have been distributed over the years, the invention of life jackets, some of the notable people who have been involved, and some of the notable rescues that have happened. You can also use that timeline to learn about the RNLI's role in the First and Second World Wars, their training systems, their fundraising activities across the years, and of course the fundraising they are doing in this, their 200th anniversary year. It is a very, very fascinating insight into how 144,000 lives have been saved by the RNLI since it was founded 200 years ago. 144,000 lives. But I wanted to focus rather than specifically on the story of the RNLI, which they can tell much better themselves than I can. I wanted to tell you some of the stories of lifeboats in the Highlands. Incidentally, if you go onto the RNLI website and have a look they have 238 lifeboat stations across the coasts. And if you go and have a look there, you can find the history of each one of the stations on there. It's such a power of work. I could have lost hours on it. When I looked at the one for Thurso, I found out that they have been awarded 17 awards for gallantry, 9 medals, and foreign awards as well. So you could go down a whole rabbit hole with whichever is your local station that you're interested in. But I'm going to look at some of the documents we have in our collections that talk about lifeboats in the Highlands. And I'm going to start in Wick by sharing a summary of lifeboat provision there written by my colleague Jennifer at Nucleus. Before any official lifeboat was stationed at Wick, lives were still being saved by those manning the pilot boat and fishing boats. This bravery and gallantry was awarded by the 8 medals given to the men of Wick, the earliest in 1828 and the most recent in 1984. An early attempt at creating a lifeboat in Wick was by famous wreck raiser and boat builder James Bremner, who designed one in 1846. It didn't use oars as was usual at the time, but was instead powered by 2 paddle wheels in the middle of the boat that were cranked by a crew of 8 men. The first trials were a great success, and the lifeboat, in addition to being very easy to manoeuvre, managed to do a mile in 6 minutes. Later trials would find that the design struggled with any kind of rough water, which made it not much use as a lifeboat. What prompted the establishment of a lifeboat at Wick was the tragedy known as Black Saturday on August the 19th, 1848. A severe gale caught the Wick herring fleet at sea, and many boats were lost trying to get back into Wick Harbour, many of them in the mouth of the harbour itself. 37 men were drowned, and only a few months after that, the British Fisheries Society had a lifeboat constructed and a station established, which was maintained by the Wick Pontlytown Harbour trustees. In 1872, a new permanent lifeboat shed was constructed at the harbour near the service bridge by the British Fisheries Society. It allowed the lifeboat to be launched straight into the river or onto the street through rear doors if the need arose. In 1895, the RNLI took over the station from the harbour trustees, also providing a brand new self-righting lifeboat. The station was temporarily closed in 1913 to await the new motor lifeboat that the RNLI were replacing the old one with, and a new lifeboat shed was built in 1915 to accommodate it. However, due to the First World War, it remained closed until 1921, although its first call only happened 5 years later in 1926, when the new motor engine meant it could attend a call out in North Ronaldsay in Orkney, as the Stromness lifeboat was being refitted. In 1994, this lifeboat was moved, this lifeboat site was moved to moorings in the inner harbour, where it remains today, although the old lifeboat shed is still used by the Wick Society as a winter home for their traditional fishing boat, the Isabella Fortuna. The RNLI says that Wick is an important station, as all traffic north around Scotland and through the Pentland Firth passes fairly close by. So, an important station, and as I've talked about before, the Pentland Firth being so particularly dangerous. And in Nucleus we hold records, papers that detail the history of other lifeboat stations in Caithness, in Hoona, in Accagill, in Thurso. And each details the boats that served in each area. If any of you are involved in the lifeboat, you'll know that the names of the boats they're preserved, they're kept. People remember which boats served which years, and often, of course, they carry the names of people who might have provided funding and so on. So each of these histories that we have at Nucleus details the years of service of each boat, their names of their crews, notable rescues that they've carried out. This is an extract from Andrew Anderson's history of the Hoona lifeboat, which operated from 1877 to 1930. During the later half of the 19th century, the Pentland Firth, which lies between the extreme north of Scotland and the Orkney Islands, was one of the main trade routes between Europe and the Americas. The speed of the tides and sudden changes in the weather conditions caused the loss of many fine vessels, together with their experienced masters and crews. Because of the large number of shipwrecks in the area, the RNLI established lifeboat stations at Scrabster in 1860 and at Longhope in 1874. These, together with the one at Wick, operated by the Pontlytown Harbour Trust and funded by the British Fisheries Society in 1848, provided the rescue services available. In spite of the distances involved and the fact that these were sailing or rowing lifeboats, many fine rescues were carried out. In order to improve the facilities at the eastern end of the Pentland Firth, the RNLI decided in 1877 to place a lifeboat at Hoona. The locals agreed to contribute towards the estimated cost of £1,100 for the lifeboat and boathouse and to support the maintenance of the station. On the 6th of December 1877, a large number of the inhabitants of Canisby assembled at Hoona to witness the ceremony for the new lifeboat. After the Reverend MacGregor had offered a prayer for the success of the boat, it was handed over to the RNLI by the chairman of the Hoona branch, Peter Keith, Esquire. The lifeboat was named WMC by Mrs. MacGregor and then launched and demonstrated its capabilities before enthusiastic spectators. The lifeboat was gifted anonymously to the RNLI by grateful parents in memory of a child whose life had been preserved on the 6th of August 1873. At their request, it was named WMC. It was a standard 34-foot long and 3 feet 3 inches broad, 10-oared, self-righting boat built by Wolfe at a cost of £363. The first boathouse was built for £252. And that's something which has very much changed, as we'll see. By the time the Hoona station closed in 1930, it had saved 27 lives. The Achergill lifeboat operated from 1877 to 1932, so roughly the same time period. But in his history of this one, Andrew Anderson describes some of the rescues at sea which it was involved in and show why this lifeboat was needed. On the 19th of November 1860, the Wick sloop Maria was unable to enter Wick Harbour because of the strong swell running in the bay. It made its way northward and anchored in Sinclair Bay in very heavy weather. By next morning, conditions had deteriorated to such an extent that help was urgently required to save the 2-man crew. Captain Tudor of the Board of Fisheries set out by gig with lines and lifeboats, while arrangements were made to transport the Wick lifeboat overland to Achergill on a carriage pulled by a team of horses. Wick Harbour was closed because of the heavy seas. When Captain Tudor arrived at Achergill, the urgency of the situation demanded immediate action. He dared not wait for the lifeboat to arrive. A vessel belonging to the Caithness Steam Shipping Company was pressed into action and moved from Achergill Harbour to Shorelands Beach, just opposite the Maria. The crew consisted of Captain Tudor, Finlay MacLean, William Thane, David Taylor, James Donaldson, William Thane Jr., Roderick MacLeod, John Sutherland, John Oak and George Cormack. The boat used for shipping goods and animals was a similar shape to that of the old lifeboat and made expressly for landing passengers at Achergill when weather prevented the steamer from calling in Wick. In spite of the heavy seas, often sweeping over and threatening to swamp the boat, they were eventually able to secure alongside. The 2 men were plucked to safety after spending a night and a day in miserable conditions. Despite the hazardous journey, a rescue boat was successfully beached with the help of willing shore spectators. The behaviour of the boat was highly commended by the spectators on the shore. Wick Lifeboat turned up afterwards. For this service, the Privy Council of the Board of Trade awarded the government silver medal to Captain Tudor and the bronze medal plus £2 each to each member of the crew who had taken part in the rescue. The RNLI also rewarded Captain Tudor with his second silver clasp. Another disaster in December 1876, when the Emily of Wolgast ran aground, was not so lucky, and 9 men died, including 4 who had gone to the rescue of the crew. And so, because of these, and because of other situations like this, the RNLI sent a new lifeboat by rail to Wick, and it was transported through the streets to great interest and great applause before going on to be launched. And there was a few things in those extracts that I found really fascinating. That image of the lifeboat having to be pulled across land to get to where it needed to go, which I'd never considered before. But also something that we see to this day, which is the huge public emotional support that lifeboats generate. So every time they mention it, those spectators on the shore, the people willing to support, willing to give money, willing to give time, when the Wick lifeboat, the new lifeboat came up to Wick and came through the streets, and the streets were lined. And again, if you've had a look at the pictures I put up on Facebook a couple of days ago, you'll see that huge crowds turning out to show their support to the lifeboats. And I suppose particularly in somewhere that is, has entirely immersed with coastal life, they're well aware of why it's so important. Lifeboat crews have of course continued to perform brave and frightening rescues at sea around our coasts ever since that first boat was invented in the 1780s. And we can see how much they've meant and continue to mean by looking at where their fundraising and launch activities appear within our collections. In 1955, the Thurso Ladies Guild and the crew of the lifeboat raised over £1,000 with a gala week. Looking at the RNLI website, that equates to around £30,000 they raised in a week from a population of under 3,000 people to support the local lifeboat. We hold commemorative launch booklets and programmes, and one in particular, a booklet to mark the naming and the dedication of the Murray Lorna at Lochinver. There's been a lifeboat station at Lochinver since 1967, but the Murray Lorna was launched in August 1989. And the programme records that the Murray Lorna was provided for through donations, through legacies, through gifts, again a common theme. Mr. Strachan, who was the chairman of the station, opened the event, and various presentations were given, anthems and hymns sung, and a service of dedication conducted. And again, that's something we see a lot through everything, is that link with faith in the sea and the dangers at the sea. So we'll often find dedication prayers, dedication services for these vessels. At that event in Lochinver, there was music supplied by the Assynt Pipe Band, the Sutherland Schools Pipe Band, the Salvation Army Band, the Assynt Church of Scotland Choir. So it's a huge event. One of the hymns, of course, that was sung was Eternal Father, Strong to Save, with those very powerful words, hear us when we cry to thee for those in peril on the sea. But I wanted to finish by moving to Skye, where my colleague Anne has some very personal connections to the Portree lifeboat. And she wrote me a history of that lifeboat service, which I'm going to finish by sharing with you. During the first week of September 1990, a meeting was held to discuss the viability of creating a lifeboat station in Portree. Some 40 local people attended, and the initial response from Les Vipond, the then divisional inspector for the area. Because of this, he was able to select 15 men to receive special training to form Skye's first lifeboat crew. From this pool of volunteers, the first 5 responding to a call-out would form the crew to man that boat. Murdoch MacArthur, the pier master at Portree, agreed to serve as the station honorary secretary, and that's where the responsibility lies. That's who has the responsibility to launch the boat. To help raise funds, the Portree's Ladies Lifeboat Guild was established under the chairmanship of Mrs. Chrissy Corrigal. It was a proud moment for Captain Darby George, RNLI branch chairman, and his wife Bernadette, who had represented the RNLI for many years, raising over £4,000 a year on Skye. The crew training took place at the headquarters in Poole during January 1991, and the temporary relief lifeboat, a Waveney-class Connaught Elizabeth Cargill, was placed at the station in February 1991. Intensive crew training continued in Portree, and on the 9th of March the official placement was made, and Portree was recognised as a fully operational all-weather lifeboat station. There was a full year of evaluation to follow before the RNLI felt justified in making the station permanent. Connaught Elizabeth Cargill was replaced by the 16-year-old Waveney-class Ralph and Joyce Swan, which had previously been based at Ramsgate and Tobermory and had saved 201 lives prior to coming to Portree. The coxswain, Donald Matheson, served the station from its inception until 1993, when Kevin Simister, who had previously been the mechanic, the only full-time paid post, was appointed coxswain. From the establishment of the station until October 2000, Portree Lifeboat has been up until 2000, so more since then, Portree Lifeboat was launched more than 124 times, saved 7 lives and brought in 74 persons, proving beyond doubt the justification of its worth. Operating in a large area around Skye, Portree works the areas serviced by up until the areas serviced by the lifeboats at Malig and Kyle of Lochalsh to the south, Lochinver to the north, and west towards Stornoway and Barra. In 1996, Portree took proud ownership of a new Trent-class lifeboat, the Stanley Watson Barker. Operating at speeds of up to 25 knots, she had state-of-the-art technology and electronic equipment, ensuring that Portree Station is now well placed for the challenges of the future. Due to the increase in speed, the operation area has now been increased. And that's what we see through other ones as well, that you may be wondering, well, why did they close Hoona and Akergill if they were needed? But by that point, the technology has changed, which means a lifeboat from elsewhere can get to that place. Anne says, in 1996, Murdoch MacArthur resigned his place as Honorary Secretary, a role which is now held by John Cameron. Inevitably, there are crew changes brought about by crewmen retiring, maximum service age is 55, leaving the island, or having to alter their work commitments. But Portree Lifeboat has always had tremendous support from the community, and there are always more volunteers ready to join than there are places available. We currently have a pool of 18 crew available to provide a crew of 6 at any time. With the support of essential community contributions, the work of the branch and the Ladies Lifeboat Guild, Portree Lifeboat will continue to provide an invaluable service to anyone using the waters around Skye. And as I say, some of our connections here are to do with our collections, some are particularly personal connections for some of my colleagues. So, as you can see, a very much appreciated, valued and needed service ever since its inauguration 200 years ago, and still is today. So I've gone over and I'm aware of it, but I hope that you found that interesting, some of the stories of lives saved at sea around our coasts. I hope you can join me next week, where we will be looking at something totally different again. We'll be looking at clubs and social spaces. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that. Thank you.